Well, rarely, probably never, has that Orwell quote been more appropriate than now. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. We are seeing a war on everything alternative. Alternative health, on alternative information in every form. And we are seeing this headed under this demonization phrase called fake news. Now, of course, if you want to see fake news, then just read the mainstream media decade after decade after decade. That is not to say there is not so-called, not really, but claimed to be, alternative sources that put out fake news. They do. And I'm going to be giving you in my opinion, a shocking example and classic example of that in a minute. But that's not what this fake news hoax, this fake news tirade is all about. It is to justify the suppression of information from the genuine alternative media, and like I say, not all of it is, so that we have one source, we go back to one source of information from which people get their opinions and views and perceptions, and that's the mainstream media. The mainstream corporate media that's connected to all the other areas of the system, politics, big pharma, big biotech, etc., which constitute what I call the mainstream everything. And perception is the key. We are being subjected to, and have been through almost all known human history, certainly modern history, to a perception deception. It's the name of one of my books. And when you are seeking to program the perceptions of your target population, then you need to control the information that they receive. Because everything comes from perception. What we think, what we do, what we support, what we won't support, what we oppose, all comes from our perceptions of life, the world, and particular events, particular people. And when you are trying to program the perceptions of your target human race, then of course, to do that most effectively, you need to make sure they only have one basic source of information, one basic way of looking at the world, of looking at events like Syria. Because from information comes perception. The last thing you want is for people to present other ways of looking at the same things from different angles, with different information, making it look different to what the mainstream is portraying. This is true of reporting of world events and their significance and their context. It is true of things like vaccines, GMO. You need to get rid of that source of information which is challenging your narrative. Now, what's happened, and I was there when it all began. There weren't many of us around at the time, but a movement began, made up of individuals, not organized, to put out information and to do research that challenged the mainstream narrative. And this has gathered and gathered and gathered in effectiveness to the point now where we are having vast numbers of people getting their information from non-mainstream sources, and the corporate media losing audiences and viewers on a catastrophic scale, catastrophic for the mainstream media, that is. And there is also, not least as a result of alternative sources of information, a growing rejection of the established order, the established tyranny, the elected dictatorships. And so, in a massive and in many ways panic-stricken response, the war on alternative sources of information has now gone into top gear. Everywhere you look, fake news, fake news. And of course, what it's being hung on is that it was fake news that got Donald Trump elected. What got him elected was the perception, wrong, I would suggest, but the perception that he was outside of the system, that he was outside the political class and establishment. That's what got him elected. And to hear Hillary Clinton this week saying that fake news is a danger to people. This is the queen of fake news, exposed in WikiLeaks emails released as the Clinton campaign was in cohorts with mainstream media corporate outlets to manipulate information to the benefit of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton lost that election because she has a history of pure evil and breathtaking mendacity and corruption. And people rejected it in very large numbers. Nothing to do with fake news. What in the end did for her was the truth coming out, ironically. So we have this focus now on what is called fake news, and this is what happens. I'm not saying for a minute there isn't fake news in what people call the alternative, but like I say, if it's fake news, it's not alternative. It's just another version of the mainstream techniques of a manipulation. But the idea is to use that and use this all-encompassing term of fake news to target the genuine alternative media, which does professional research and professionally make sure in every way it can that its facts are right before it goes public with them. That's nothing like, whew, are you kidding? That's nothing like the totality of the alternative media. But that's the part of it that they're targeting, because that's the one that's dangerous to them. And of course, mainstream media loves all this. Of course it's going to jump on this coordinated, blatantly so, attack on the alternative media under this fake news banner. Because it wants to protect itself. It wants to protect itself from the rejection of people. And thus it supports it. And what you get is, as long as you as long as you are going along and you're not a danger to this global agenda that I've been exposing all these years, then you're basically left alone. When there was an alternative media that wasn't actually that influential because it was in its early days, just left alone, really. No problem. Once it becomes a problem, then they turn on it, which is what's happening now. In the same way, as long as you are in vast, overwhelming numbers accepting vaccinations and your children being vaccinated, well, okay. Oh, no, it's not compulsory. No, it's a choice. As long as everyone does it, that's fine. Now, people in ever greater numbers are rejecting that by doing research into actually what the consequences are. Now we're seeing coming in these laws to make vaccination compulsory in parts of the world, and it's planned to be universal in the end. And I've got a little bit of, well, what would you call it? Information, advice? I don't know. Maybe you could call it seeing things for what they are in terms of the mainstream media. So, mainstream, this is why your audiences are collapsing and your credibility has never been lower. People in ever greater numbers are sick and tired of your lies, your bias, your systematic manipulation of so-called news and information, and the fact that they are realizing ever more clearly that you are just an arm of the very establishment you should, if you were real journalists, be holding to account. That's why what's happening to you is happening, not because of any fake news, but because of your fake news, decade after decade after decade. I mean, this is a report this week in a mainstream newspaper about the fact that the terrorists, because that's what they are, United States, British-backed, armed, trained, supported terrorists in Aleppo in Syria. This is the report on how they have been virtually now removed from Aleppo after the extraordinarily grotesque treatment of people, civilians, children, under their control in parts of that city. Instead of celebrating the fact that these people have been freed now in great numbers from that tyranny, from that horror, this is what you get. With Syrian city falling to Assad and Putin, the executions of women and children begin a meltdown of humanity. Evidence? Bugger all! There's no one on the ground there in terms of correspondence. They're getting their information from, if you call it that, from sources that are absolutely not to be trusted. I mean, it quotes here the White Helmets. The White Helmets, who are an organization supposedly created to help people in a humanitarian way, who are funded by all the players who have funded, armed and trained these terrorists, including ISIS, United States, Britain, EU, etc. Oh yeah, that's an unbiased source. And they also quote over and over again in terms of Syria, the mainstream media, an organization called the Syria Observatory for Human Rights. Oh, that sounds grand. Oh, bet they've got a big building. They must be in Syria. They must. You're going to quote them at what's happening in Syria in such detail with unquestioned, questioning their accuracy. Do you know what the Syria Observatory for Human Rights is? One man. But at least he lives in Syria. No, he doesn't. He lives in Coventry, in England. Oh, the Syria Observatory for Human Rights said this is terrible what Assad's doing. The man in Coventry hates Assad. And the mainstream media talk about fake news. Do they have mirrors in these buildings? I guess they must not. Within 24 hours, an estimated 10,000 people had fled the horror, but last night there were at least 50,000 still trapped. We're seeing in other mainstream sources things like 100,000 people are still under siege from Assad and the Russians. Evidence? Zilch. And, you know, there are so many ironies in this. I'll give you another one. When the mainstream media has played its part, which is the idea of destroying the alternative, then do you think this hidden hand that wants rid of the alternative media, for reasons I've discussed, is going to allow any part of the mainstream media to tell the truth about anything? Have you seen how the mainstream media even has been targeted more and more around the world in terms of suppression of what it can say? Talk about turkeys campaigning for Christmas. So it's the Russians, it's the Russians, it's the Russians all the way through the mainstream media. It's the Russians that manipulated the American election. Evidence? Oh, the CIA said. Yes, the CIA, who has a history of mendacity that is truly staggering. If the CIA ever told the truth, it would genetically implode from the shock. It's the Russians, I burnt me toast, it's the Russians, oh yeah, it's the Russians, he burnt his toast. It's pathetic. And what we're seeing is in all these different areas, not just in things like Syria, we're seeing the imposition of rules, regulations and laws that are stopping the free flow of information. So, again, we have had now the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, saying that a new definition of anti-Semitism is going to be introduced. Now, this is absolutely nothing to do with protecting Jewish people from attacks and racism. Nothing. It's about protecting the merciless regime in Tel Aviv from legitimate exposure and criticism. That's what it's about. And again, fake news. Theresa May said that one of the reasons this is happening is because attacks on Jewish people in Britain are reportedly on the rise. Well, where do these figures come from? Must be solid, surely. They must be independent. Otherwise, we won't believe them and change things as a result of them. Well, these figures come from an organisation originally set up by the British Board of Jewish Deputies, the big Jewish organisation in Britain, which is now, what was set up is now a charity, where the guy running it gets a really fat salary every year. And it is founded on donations, massive donations, from Jewish people who are frightened of racism and attacks. So, will they go on funding that unless they believe that they are in danger from these attacks and they're rising? The question answers itself. And yet we're taking reports from these organizations, or this organization in this case, on attacks, anti-Semitic attacks in Britain. Everywhere you look, there are vested interests providing so-called information on which the world changes. And free flow of information is suppressed. And what we're looking at now is a takeover of information, a gathering global ministry of truth, as Orwell called it in 1984. A ministry of truth in that book, whose real role was propaganda and revising history to suit the perception deception of the day. And one of the major areas this is happening is in involving the internet giants of search engines, Google, the monster that is Google, and social media like Facebook, Twitter. See, this has been the game. You start social media and search engines and all this stuff, and you then allow the free flow of information. And people think, oh, this is great. You understand that. They think, oh, this is great. You know, you can say what you like, you can have an opinion, and all that stuff. Yeah. But then, as they get bigger and bigger and bigger, this has been the plan all along, there comes a point where they start to dominate the flows of information and the means of those flows that people get. And once you've reached that point where you think you're strong enough and big enough and unassailable enough, then you start censoring that information. And that's what we're seeing now. More and more and more getting alternative information circulating on these social medias is getting more and more difficult. There was some figures I was given this week about my own work. For instance, on Facebook, there are about 700,000 what you might call followers that want information from my Facebook page. Of those 700,000, only between 5 and 10% actually receive alerts and receive the posts when they're posted every day. 5 to 10%. And then there's Twitter. In the last year, my YouTube channel has received 17.7 million views of videos. That's around, I'm told, 48,000 views a day. Of that 48,000, an average of 104 come from Twitter, even though those links are posted on Twitter every time there's a new video. And clearly, there are algorithms and there are blocking codes being used to stop the free flow of information that the system doesn't want. We're also seeing organizations like YouTube, owned by Google, demonetizing videos from the alternative media based on the information they're putting out. And a lot of people in the alternative media actually survive, often with a meager income from money they get from monetization of YouTube videos. And the system knows that. That's why that's been specifically targeted. Like I say, there's a war on alternative information. And just to show you that what is happening to me in terms of suppression of this information on social media is not just happening to me. It's happening to people right across the genuine alternative media. This is a story this week. What they call this stuff is ghost banning, apparently. This is a headline. Ghost banning on social media, the start of systematic censorship. There is mounting evidence, it says, that alternative news providers are the targets of censorship on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and elsewhere. We are told it's called ghost banning, meaning you are present, though invisible, in plain sight, and the user is completely unaware. The goal is frighteningly obvious. Deny an offending website traffic to the point that it disappears from public view. This, it says, is a new business model of the old art of controlling what is considered acceptable speech by the powers that be. As a result, legacy news outlets that comprise of the world of corporate mainstream media are propped, crowding out alternative views and dissent. Freedom of speech faces an existential threat, or existential threat. Now, this is a quote from Craig Murray. Craig Murray is a former UK ambassador who writes and speaks out about the way the system is so corrupt. And this is what he says. I had never heard of ghost banning until I was ghost banned by Twitter. That, of course, is the idea. They censor you without realizing, or you realizing you are censored. People no longer get notifications when I post, and the tweet only turns up in the Twitter line of followers who happen to be logged in at the time my tweet goes out. Exactly the sort of thing that's happening to me. Those logging in later will no longer see tweets I issued while they were away. Most of my tweets no longer show up on Twitter searches, and further restrictions are applied when people retweet my tweets. Since ghost banning, he says, traffic to this website from Twitter has fallen 90%. This is what is going on. And it's because the system, which these internet giants are expressions of, are terrified of alternative information, which trashes and dismantles their deception. But let me make this point, and it's equally important. Does fake news exist outside of the mainstream media? Too right it does. And those peddlers of it are helping to destroy the genuine alternative media by giving that which wants to destroy it ammunition. They hold up this fake news crap and say this is the alternative media. I was sent a classic example of it this week from a website called Your Newswire. Operates out of California, and it's run by someone who years ago was a webmaster of davidicke.com. The irony is not lost. And this article, he says in quotes, is written by someone, we are told, called Baxter Dimitri. Baxter Dimitri does not exist. And the picture put alongside Baxter Dimitri is actually the picture of a British sound recordist who I met a number of times years ago. This is what the headline says. Lady Gaga, Prince Charles is not human, end quote. So this is a classic clickbait headline designed to make you click on it and add to the advertising revenue of the site. Lady Gaga, the buzz name there. Oh, Lady Gaga, Prince Charles, another one. Put them together. Prince Charles is not human. Now, people will realize that I've been talking about stuff like that for a long time, not least in books like Children of the Matrix, about a human reptilian hybrid bloodline that actually is manipulating human affairs. But I do it in books where I'm quoting people who've experienced this. I'm quoting people who have knowledge of this by name. So people can then make their own minds up based on that. But this is what this story has done. Basically taking that theme and then making it up. Lady Gaga has told senior staff and associates that Prince Charles is not human, but is a hybrid that shapeshifts between human and reptilian form, straight out of my work. Apparently, Lady Gaga met Prince Charles at the Royal Variety Performance in London on December the 7th and was criticised in some quarters of the tabloid press for failing to observe royal etiquette, all that stuff. It's now been revealed by whom? Doesn't say. Why? They don't exist. It's now been revealed that Lady Gaga avoided Prince Charles after he shapeshifted during a brief introduction. Quote, Prince Charles was 8 foot tall with yellow eyes that flicker and scaly skin the colour of an iguana. Source of the quote by Lady Gaga? Is it anywhere else? No. The Prince of Wales shapeshifted between this state and human form 2 or 3 times, quote, after introducing himself to her. She claims, Lady Gaga claims, here you go, that she saw him shapeshift in the audience while he performed her song, or she performed her song, maybe he did too, A Million Reasons. Quote, his face in the crowd flashed between human and reptile. I could see his reptile teeth glistening in the light from the other side of the room. Evidence for this? Support for this quote? Zilch. And she is supposed to have said all this, but of course never did. And then this writer, Baxter Dimitri, who doesn't actually exist, says, Lady Gaga's first-hand experiences of the reptilian Illuminati chime with my own research and second-hand accounts. He says, I have dedicated, and what he's doing there is basically taking, well, he's not because he doesn't exist. He's taking basically the theme of my own life and then claiming for himself. I've dedicated the last 5 years to researching the elusive tyrannical powers that rule our world. Traveling to over 80 countries, what, in 5 years? Blimey. He gets around. And it never ceases to amaze me how many people from very different walks of life have told me stories about seeing people briefly turn into reptilians before their very eyes. I've been told this, says the non-existent Baxter Dimitri. I've been told this by American cable news anchors, Ethiopian goat herds, speaking goats, that's good, and Australian Aboriginals, just to name a few. And in Peru, a respected psychic, unnamed, no background, no circumstances. In Peru, Peru, which is very much connected to my life, as some people will know. In Peru, a respected psychic told me she sees powerful politicians like Obama, Angela Merkel, and Justin Trudeau turn into reptiles whenever she watches an international news channel. Support for that? Zilch. And this claims to be the alternative media. And the genuine alternative needs to start addressing this and calling this stuff out and those behind it, because it is giving the very fuel to those mainstream everything powers that are seeking to discredit and destroy the genuine alternative media. And there needs to be a second category: the genuine alternative media and the fake news, clickbait crap. They need to be very clearly defined as not being the same. But there is some good in all this, in a way. The fact that there is this concerted, coordinated demonization of the alternative media under the genuine one, under the heading of fake news, means that we are having an effect. These social media giants don't suppress information from people like me because it's a bit of fun. If it wasn't having an effect, they wouldn't even bother. And so it is confirmation that the world is changing. The mainstream everything is now being challenged in its perception deception. And this is manifesting as more and more people seeing the truth behind the curtain. And so this is not going to go away. It's going to increase these attempts to not just demonize the alternative media, but legislate against it.